Right, it's time now for Focus, and today we're heading to Russia, where a bill to decriminalise some types of domestic violence has been approved by the lower house of parliament. While Amnesty International has condemned the bill as a sickening attempt to trivialise domestic violence, supporters of the so-called slapping law see it as protecting the right of parents to discipline their children. The bill is due to go to the upper house on Friday. From Moscow, Elena Volochin and Thomas Lowe report.
A desire to preserve the family. That's how Russian legislators are explaining their proposed law. Last summer, the Duma made domestic violence punishable by 2 years in prison. Conservatives consider this unacceptable. They believe parents should be able to physically punish their children.
It can sound scary when we speak about hitting, but we're talking about violence which doesn't have consequences for health, and even violence without violence. In the Russian family tradition, parent-child relations must be built on the power and authority of parents, which can't be substituted by any other authority.
In effect, domestic violence, said to be without serious consequences, will be depenalised. Yet Russia's legal system already offers little support to the victims. 2 years ago, Natalia's partner beat her up so badly she grabbed hold of a knife to defend herself. Lightly wounded, her partner phoned the ambulance and the police. He was taken to hospital. Natalia, covered in bruises, was taken into police custody.
I tried to speak to the paramedics. I told them he hit me all over. I've got a headache. I don't feel well and I can hardly stand up. They just said, "Look at what you've done."
At the police station, Natalia felt so bad, officers phoned for an ambulance. But they accused her of faking it, and the paramedics initially refused to take her.
I implored them, saying, "If you leave me here, I'll die. I really feel unwell. I hardly had the strength to speak."
Once at the hospital, the doctor wanted to keep her there, but the police refused. They took her back to the station and used threats to try to get her to sign a confession.
They told me that if I sign, I can go home. If not, they'll send me to prison.
Natalia was later diagnosed with traumatic brain injury and concussion. She's now under investigation for premeditated aggression and faces 10 years in prison. Her aggressor has never been convicted.
I asked the investigator if he thought it was possible to kill someone by punching them. He said, of course it is. But for us, the right of self-defense works only if a pistol is put against your head.
Those who defend the victims say this isn't an isolated case. In a Moscow suburb, Alyona set up a refuge. On the second floor of this house in the countryside, 5 rooms are set aside for women and their children. Some of the victims are waiting to receive legal and medical help. They too were confronted by the slow response from authorities.
Not long ago, a woman was killed even after phoning the police 6 times, and that's not out of the ordinary. Today, a woman has to look out for her own safety. She's alone against everyone, against her family, who stop her making her problems public, against the police, who tell her she has nowhere to turn against her aggressor, and against her friends as well, who make her understand that her husband beats her up because she's a bad partner and a bad mother.
Пап, перед сном ты меня просто обними и на ушко скажи, что лучше сына не найти. Не оставляй меня одного. Я прошу, не надо. Не кричи по пустякам, я тебя люблю, тебя. И я знаю почему.
To protest against the trivialisation of violence, Anastasia goes out into the streets wearing makeup. It's an isolated protest that goes almost unnoticed.
In our society, violence towards a woman, like violence in general, is the norm. We live in an ultra-militarized society where it's more shameful to be beaten up than to beat someone up.
But there's another reason Anastasia is protesting alone. A different law bans all group protests unless the authorities give the go-ahead.
Most of the time, requests for the right to demonstrate are refused. The only thing we can do in Russia without legal authorization is to go out alone with a sign. But when an activist does that, he or she finds themselves alone in a hostile environment.
For those defending women's rights, The new law on domestic violence will only serve to make the critical situation even worse. In Russia, more than 70,000 people are reported as victims of domestic violence each year. The real number is higher, as more than 70% of victims suffer in silence.
Right, for more on this, I'm now joined in the studio by Louis Lagrange. She's an expert on Russia. Hello, thank you very much for coming in. Now, let's start with more on what's actually in this bill. Domestic abuse, which doesn't seriously harm family members, will now be treated as a civil rather than criminal offence unless it's done repeatedly. But what constitutes serious harm?
Well, this is a big question. Actually, during last summer, all violences with no serious harm were depenalized, excluding violence, domestic violence. But you have a good point here. We don't know what it is exactly. Plus, as you said, repeated violence then are still penalized. But how do you show that it was repeated? It needs a complaint, a first complaint, but you will not go for the first complaint because it's not penalized anymore. So there is something tricky to me in this law about this repeated part.
Why do you think we're seeing this happen now?
I think there are several reasons. One of them is the idea that the state shall not interfere in the family. This has been something very important for conservative members of the parliament, but also for the church, the Orthodox Church. So I think this is one element. Another element, I think, is a reaction to what is happening in some Western countries. For instance, in France, recently we had a law completely opposite to the one just adopted in Russia, which says that any violence, even psychological violence in the family, is forbidden. So I think there is a kind of game between the West and the East in this law too.
Would you say that this is a big step back for Russia, especially considering, as we saw in the report, that victims of domestic abuse don't seem to be getting the help they need as it is?
Yes, exactly, and that's why I'm not sure it's a big step backwards in per se, because the situation was not very good, even with a law providing penalization for such crimes. I think the biggest problem is the signal that it gives, of course, saying that there is nothing wrong. All the speeches that were given in the Duma, for instance, around this law are saying that domestic violence is not a big deal and that the state should not interfere. So I think that the main problem is actually the fact that the police and the enforcement agencies are not willing and not trained to react to domestic violence in general.
What about the general population? Because you mentioned conservatives and the church, it's quite clear how they feel, but are the lawmakers who were in favour of depenalising this kind of abuse, are they actually representing the population? Do people in Russia tend to think that actually slapping your children or your partner is not a big deal and should be kept a private affair?
Well, as far as I know, the majority of the population say they are supporting this law. But I think that most of the people didn't read the law, firstly. Secondly, I doubt that 50% of the population, being women, they are supporting this kind of law. And as you just mentioned, it is very interesting to see that the law concerns both violence against children and against women. How do we react to this idea that that education and the equal relation between men and women in a couple are treated by the same law? So the support is always something tricky in a country where the media are not so free, the civil society is not so developed and is subject to a crackdown from the authorities' side.
I was going to ask you about that because I understand that women's rights is a particular interest of yours. How would you describe the situation of women in Russia and how they've evolved? Has there been any progress or not in the last few years?
I think there have been a deterioration, but it's difficult to say because most of the time they don't go to the police, they don't complain, so statistics are difficult to obtain. What we know is that the number of associations fighting against discriminations against women and trying to protect them have grown increasingly. There are now 200 associations. But we know at the same time that there is a crackdown from the authorities since the law on foreign agents that is hampering these initiatives. So the context is not favoring the sensibilization or the protection of women. Shelters are too few to really help women in complicated situations, for instance.
Now, we're running out of time, but I just want to ask you quickly, looking at these images, it begs the question, just how well represented are women in Parliament? How many of these women would have voted for this bill?
Well, you know, the person who was bringing this law is a woman. And she said that it's more humiliating for a woman to go to court against her husband than for a woman to be beaten by her husband. So this is again something difficult.
So mentalities need to change, not just laws. All right, thank you very much indeed, Elom, for coming in for today's Focus.